We want to thank you all for coming and joining us this morning. I know you're from near and far. Thanks to Anna, it's 1 o'clock in the morning where she is, but she's with us this morning, so we're happy for that. So it is a pleasure to welcome you to join the webinar of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism and the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, GGGI as it's called. My name is Sandra Grant, and I am the Acting Executive Director at the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism Secretariat in Belize City. I am thrilled to welcome you to our second session on abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear in the Caribbean, challenges, successes, and opportunities. Now, this webinar series, we had our first session on the 18th of February last month, and we had a very good session with our participants. So we promised to be here today, and today, the whole aim of the webinar series is to discuss efforts to address ALDFG in the Caribbean and to gather further feedback on the draft Caribbean Regional Action Plan to prevent abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gears. At the moment, I would just like to take this opportunity to welcome our first speaker, and he will do the welcome and introduction to the webinar. He is no other than Joel Baziuk, and he's the Associate Director for GGGI. Now, Joel has participated in numerous technical working groups concerning lost and abandoned fishing gears, including the Aquaculture Stewardship Council Technical Advisory Group on marine litter and gear management. And at the IUCN led a working group on development of a position paper on ERP for fishing gears. Now, during his tenure as operations supervisor at Stevenson's Harbour Authority, Canada's largest commercial fishing harbour, Joel started an end-of-life net recycling program and to find a sustainable way to dispose of end-of-life fishing nets. And in 3 years, this program managed to recycle some 75,000 kilograms of end-of-life net. So at this juncture, I'll ask Joel, please, to take the floor and to do the welcome and introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grant. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Hannah, I don't even know what to say to you, apart from thank you for being here, as Sandra's already mentioned. I'm delighted to be here to continue this webinar series with the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, and hopefully to have a really robust discussion today, trying to find some answers to how to address abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear in the Caribbean context. And as Dr. Grant already mentioned, one of the key focuses today will be mechanisms for how to do that. We'll hear from Hannah as well later on about some policy frameworks on how to address ALDFG around the world to sort of contextualize what's happening in the broader global context when it comes to this. And then later on, I'll give a presentation on the Caribbean Regional Action Plan for ALDFG that Hannah and I had put together a few years back, and sort of give an overall scope of that. We'll dive a little deeper into that than we did in the previous webinar. And the hope here is to get people to, first of all, be aware that it exists, but also, I think, most crucially, to get some more feedback and input into it, as this is such a very diverse region that we're trying to encompass when it comes to that report, and try to figure out what's missing, because it's been a few years since it's been looked at and updated, and nothing is going to help make that report and that action plan better than getting feedback from some of the folks that are in the room, as well as others who might not be able to be here today. So that document is available in the meeting materials to hopefully solicit some feedback there, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion about it today. So I want to thank everyone again, the hosts from the CRFM, as well as Hannah as our additional speaker, and everyone who's here today to participate in this discussion. So thank you very much, and Sandra, I will hand it back over to you.
Hey, thank you, Joel. So as I said earlier, this is our second session. So I just want to set the stage for a reminder of the first session where we looked at provide some background information on the actions on the ground, and also to include the development of how the action plan was developed. So we had presentation on the work of the GGGI in the region. We had Ms. Shelleen Berry, who spoke about the work that was being done in Jamaica. We had Dr. Kanai from the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, who talked about their work in Trinidad and Tobago. And we had Ms. Ali, who spoke about the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute work. Notable was the Fisher-led ALDFG awareness activity. So at that meeting, Joel did introduce the action plan. So we'll move on now today and to dive deeper, as Joel said. And today we'll focus on the policy framework and the plan itself. And we really want some discussion and some inputs on the action plan and how we can move this forward. So today we're going to have 3 presentations. We're going to have from, I want to at this point juncture introduce the team. Today we have 3 presentations. The first will be from Miss Hannah Pragnell-Raasch, and she is the Policy Specialist Consultant at GGGI Initiative and Ocean Conservancy. Now, Hannah is a global policy leader for Ocean Conservancy, and she provides technical guidance and expertise for GGGI policy and advocacy work. This includes working with government. She has led on government roundtables, provided technical guidance on various policy interventions, such as international legally binding instrument for plastic pollution and speaking engagement at high-level policy events. And she has also led a number of GGGI's signature projects and is responsible for the development of a number of GGGI's technical reports and knowledge products. And she will present on the policy overview of ALDFG. Next, we will have speaker, myself. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I've been working here at the CRFM for about 4 years now. But I've worked at both national and regional levels, working in Jamaica and Belize in fisheries and across the region. I think my most memorable experience is working with fishermen in Guave. So that's me for now. And next we have Joel Baziuk, which I spoke earlier about. And you have had an introduction to Joel already. So let's get to the meat of the matter. So we'll ask Anna to take the floor, and she will talk about the policy overview. Thank you so much. Over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to CRFM and of course, Joel, for convening the workshop here today, and for all of you being here. I will apologize in advance if this isn't as articulate as it should be. I'm based in well, just outside of Sydney, Australia, so I'm on the other side of the pond, so to say. So it's a little early in the morning. So I'm here today anyway to go over the policy governance of ALDFG from an international point of view. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. As part of GGGI's work, a lot of our policy work, of course, revolves around working with governments around the world. And I'm sure you probably saw this slide at the previous workshop during Joel's presentations, but it's just to visualize that we have our membership across the world and highlight the 24 supporting governments that the GGGI has under its membership. And through that work with the governments, we provide a series of technical guidance and expertise to our government members, as well as some capacity building and training opportunities, informing their policy and best practices, data collection on ALDFG and end-of-life gear, which is shared through, or which can be shared through the Global Grey Gear initiatives data portal. Canada, for example, is one of the government members we have that shares their data from their lost gear reporting protocol, their national reporting system. We also support governments on the development of national and regional action plans, which Joel has shared a little bit at the last workshop about the regional action plan we've developed with CRFM and others for GCFI a few years ago on developing a regional action plan for the Caribbean, also supporting international policy priorities as well. So there's a variety of different ways that we work with our governments. When a government does become a member, we tailor that towards what those national priorities are, how they feed into the regional landscape and also international landscape as well, in an attempt to kind of build coordination and consistency among what's happening nationally and how that feeds into the regional and international landscape as well. And should governments want to join the GGGI, there's a simple statement of support that the relevant ministry or ministries can sign that sort of formalize that commitment to the country managing ghost gear in their relative country. So again, as I'm sure you've already heard about, we have our best practice frameworks for the management of fishing gear and also for the management of aquaculture gear. And a lot of our policy recommendations and interventions sort of hinge on those best practices. So trying to provide that practical guidance that is then connected to meaningful policy measures as well. So if you haven't already, urge you to take a look at the best practice frameworks. This, of course, was also formed the basis of the regional action plan that we developed a few years ago for the Caribbean. So tailoring those best practices to the circumstances of the region. And of course, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the issue of ghost gear varies with geography, the circumstances, the resources available, etc. So the best practices and the relevant policy interventions at a local and also national and regional scale vary according to those circumstances as well. So just to give a broad, I'm not going to go into detail for each one of these, but just to give a broad timeline, this graphic from the World Bank kind of visualizes the timeline of conventions, different conventions, frameworks, interventions over the years that in some way, shape or form touch on different elements of ALDFG governance around the world. Not all countries are obviously party to every single convention or protocol that is on the screen right now, but this is just to provide that sort of broad concept of the different interventions that do touch on ghost gear in some way, shape or form. And some of them are quite broad in respects to including ghost gear, and they might be included as it pertains to marine litter. Other examples have a deeper focus on ghost gear and fishing gear in particular. So there's a variety of levels. Some have voluntary measures, others have binding regulations as well. So there's a real mixture across the international landscape when it comes to ALDFG governance. And I'm going to touch on a few key ones here just to give a bit of an overview of the key ones pertaining to ghost gear here. So the FAO have their voluntary guidelines on the marking of fishing gear, which were officially endorsed back in 2018 at the 33rd session of the Committee of Fisheries, or COFI. And the idea was to provide a tool that contributed to sustainable fisheries, that also improved the state of the marine environment and enhance the safety at sea by combating and minimizing the occurrence of ALDFG. And the guidelines, they're voluntary in nature, but they are designed to assist states in meeting their obligations under international law and relevant international agreements. And they are focused specifically on gear marking. And I see on the screen as well, we've had some of our colleagues join from FAO. So if there are any questions on that, they'd be far better placed to answer those questions. But again, urge you to take a look at those guidelines if you haven't done already, as they also provide a risk assessment about the different gear types as well, and what the different gear marking options may be available, and examples of how those can be utilised and appropriate for the different fisheries in question. We then also have the International Maritime Organization, which is the United Nations agency responsible for the safety and security of shipping and the prevention of marine and atmospheric pollution from ships. So as we look at ALDFG, of course, it is considered one of the most harmful form of marine plastic pollution, and therefore falls under the remit of MARPOL Annex 5, which specifically looks at the prevention of pollution by garbage from ships. So there's been a few significant advances under the IMO regarding managing ALDFG. Most significantly, there was a mandate to have mandatory gear marking, a goal-based mandatory gear marking requirements for fishing gear. We are still in the process of developing those criteria. It's been a bit of a slow process, so it's not as far as advanced as we probably would have liked to have seen by this point in time. And this falls under the marine plastic, the action plan, to address marine plastic litter from ships, which was a resolution that was put forward at MEPC 73, adopted in 2021. Initially, the action plan was due for review in 2023, and for its finalization and implementation this year. However, it has just been updated during PPR 12 back in January for its approval at MEPC 83 next month. So there is a new timeline in place for the actions through to 2030. So that includes the gear marking provision and also lost gear reporting requirements as well, which were discussed quite extensively at PPR 12, and what the different criteria should be for lost gear reporting, which data points should be mandatory, which data points should be voluntary. Again, this is a work in progress and will be the topic of conversation for subsequent PPR and MEPC meetings to come. But they are two sort of very significant measures that are being discussed in the international policy fora in an attempt to prevent and mitigate the occurrence and impacts of ALDFG. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the negotiations that have been taking place to develop an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, also referred to as the Plastics Treaty. So this was off the back of the UNEA resolution back a few years ago now, in March 2022. I want to say, and this provides an opportunity to address plastic fishing and aquaculture gear as it pertains to ALDFG being the most harmful form of marine plastic pollution, recognising its disproportionate impacts of small island developing states and less developed countries. We also recognise that there's a lack of an international governance framework. So whilst there's a number of different policy fora, interventions, frameworks, regulations around the world that do touch on elements of managing ALDFG, there isn't an international structure in place that provides cohesion and coordination across those different policy interventions. So the Plastics Treaty does provide that international framework that could provide coordination and cohesion across those different policies that could help prevent, mitigate, and remediate the impacts and occurrence of ALDFG. It also provides a holistic approach that covers the full life cycle. So this is an important point as well, that the Plastics Treaty should be looking at the full life cycle of plastics. So in regards to that, the full life cycle of plastic fishing and aquaculture gear would be addressed as well. And it would be, again, specific to the mandate of ending plastic pollution, and therefore it's the provisions that we've been advocating for are geared towards the prevention of ALDFG. So it's not looking to try and prevent fishing taking place or penalise fishers, by no means. It's just looking to implement measures and include measures specifically to address ALDFG whilst remaining under the mandate of the Plastics Treaty. So far we've had 5 sessions of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. We were due to have the last one at the end of last year in November, which took place in Busan, South Korea. Consensus was not reached, so the negotiating process has been extended, and INC 5.2 will be taking place in Geneva later this year in August, the first week in August. So we will be working with our member governments and non-member governments alike to ensure that ghost gear remains a priority in the text. Over the years that we've been involved in the process in the INCs, there's been variations in how ALDFG is addressed and if it is being included in the provisional rounds of the text. At the end of INC 5, we were proud to see that there was recognition of ALDFG and the need to have specific provisions for ALDFG. And as I mentioned, this provides a unique opportunity to secure those bold measures that cover the full life cycle. And as I said, it's not to prevent or prevent fishing or penalise fishers, but it's actually to try and ensure that we're safeguarding that the global food security, fisheries sustainabilities, and also safeguard the lives and livelihoods of those that depend on fishing. So the different elements that we've been advocating for throughout this INC process, and that we will continue to do so as the negotiations continue, is to ensure that there's measures for plastic fishing and aquaculture gear across the full life cycle. So ensuring that there's provisions around gear design, so looking at how we include traceability, design and labelling standards, and also look at how we design gear for circularity. Gear marking is also something that we've been advocating for alongside it still being considered at IMO. We believe it's an important component to include. And whilst it's great that IMO is considering gear marking, it's still not definitive and signed, sealed and delivered that that gear marking criteria will be included under IMO. So we want to ensure that we're still advocating for it under the Plastics Treaty, so that we don't find ourselves not having gear marking included under the Plastics Treaty nor at IMO. We're also advocating for a no-fault loss gear reporting. So by no fault, we mean that if fishers lose gear and report that gear, that they're not automatically penalised. Of course, we understand that gear is lost predominantly not intentionally by the fisher. There's a number of different reasons as to why gear is lost. So we feel that a lost gear reporting system is really important to ensure that fishers are comfortable in reporting gear should it become lost, and also share the reasons as to why that gear became lost in the first place, so that we can build an understanding of why gear is being lost and then provide the relevant intervention points to help prevent that loss occurring. There's also a call for effective portside collection facilities for end-of-life gear, fostering and improving recycling systems and ensuring that there's long-term funding mechanisms to support such systems, and also considerations for extended producer responsibility for fishing and aquaculture gear as well. And across all of these provisions, we're very mindful and recognising that there needs to be a just transition. Sorry, there is appropriate and just disposal and remediation, but there is a just transition that supports those countries that don't necessarily have the resources available to implement the measures that potentially will become under the Plastics Treaty. So there needs to be a mechanism in place, a funding mechanism in place, and the relevant capacity building and technical guidance, etc., to support all countries in implementing whatever measures end up in place through the Plastics Treaty. We've also been clear to ensure that any dedicated provisions that do end up in the Plastics Treaty are notwithstanding of plastic fishing and aquaculture gear being considered under the other relevant provisions of the treaty. And again, we will see how INC 5.2 shakes down and what language is included. And again, we will be on the ground in the period leading up from now until then, working with governments to ensure that these provisions remain considered within the Plastics Treaty, and that there remains support for an ambitious treaty on the whole as well as being included for ALDFG. So just to quickly summarize, I know its policy isn't necessarily the most attractive topic for when we're looking at ALDFG, but it's certainly very important. And when we're looking at what practical actions can take place in a local and regional context, having those policy interventions in mind, as well as to how they can ultimately help prevent gear becoming lost in the first place. But then if gear does become lost, how can we mitigate those impacts? And then how can we remediate the gear that already is lost in the environment, of course. As I mentioned, there's no international framework currently to cover the full life cycle of gear. So that's why there has been, we have prioritised a lot of focus on the Plastics Treaty over the past few years to try and ensure that fishing and aquaculture gear is considered under the Plastics Treaty, and that it can serve as that umbrella to provide the international coordination and foster collaboration around the issue as well across different nations and regions, and learn from lessons from around the world and pull in those best practices that make most sense from a policy point of view as well. So I think that is the end of that short snippet. We will be around for questions. I'm not too sure how long I will last for the duration of the workshop, but please do feel free to get in touch with myself or Joel, of course, if you've got any questions about the different policy interventions, how we can help support local or national policies, and of course, if there's any countries that would like to become a GGGI member, would welcome having a conversation and setting those motions in place. So thank you again, and I will hand back to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that presentation on the policy framework. Next presenter is myself, and I will look at the MOU, the CRFM GGI MOU, and its ongoing project activity as it relates to abandoned gears. So gears are lost for many, many reasons. And as you walk around on the beaches, you might see gears being abandoned on the beaches, littering the beaches. And a lot of it is caused because the gears are damaged because of weather, which disperse the nets, the gears, and others. They're snagged. As Anna said, it is no fault of the fishers. And sometimes the gear loss is expected by a lot of fishers, especially trap fishermen. They will tell you that I'm expected to lose about 40% of my traps every set. And that's just a way of life for them. Some of the gears are intentionally discarded because of IUU fishing activities. And of course, the lack of access to and the cost of shoreline collection facilities. There's no way to dump or to place your discarded gears on shore, and so it's just abandoned on the beach side. So the Ministerial Council endorsed the collaboration with GGI. We also affirm its commitment to prevent abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gears in the region, and noted the strong link between ghost gear and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in a number of resolutions that they have made since 2022. So the CRFM and GGI signed the MOU on the 8th of September 2023 as part of their collaborative efforts to establish a framework to facilitate continued collaboration to improve management of abandoned gear. And as you can see, this was done virtually, but we were able to accomplish such a feat since we have been working with GGI for since 2018. And so this was a momentous occasion for us to be able to sign this MOU. So I'm just going to highlight the main points of the MOU. And what we want to look at is the capacity building for the purpose of developing skills, expertise, and experience appropriate to the Caribbean reality in realizing sustainable fisheries development and best practice management of fishing gears. We want to also source and mobilize resources, whether they are financial, technical, or human resources, in order to work on the abandoned gear issues. We want to work collaboratively to collect regional data on ghost gear incidents, causes, and hotspots in order to build a roadmap to inform future solutions work in the Caribbean region and share those data on the GGI portal. Fourth, we want to collaborate with GGGI and the CRFM and other partners as well, including our international funding agencies in designing and implementing and evaluating projects, activities, events related to lost and abandoned fishing gears, which supports the CRFM's mission. We want to work collaboratively with GGGI and the CRFM member states and other relevant regional fisheries organizations as appropriate to standardize data collection to contribute to better understanding of ghost gear, both within the Caribbean, regionally, and globally. They communicate with member states and territories about CRFM's participation in and collaboration with GGGI to address the ghost gear problem in the Caribbean region, and also distribute relevant GGG information to member states, particularly international and national policymakers where appropriate, and then encouraging acknowledgements, endorsement, and further support by member states to GGGI's regional collaboration. We want to also support the local GGI projects. We want to workshops in the Caribbean region and best practices on the management of fishing gears with appropriate technical expertise where possible, and also in any other related activities that is deemed necessary. So this is the core of the MOU between the CRFM and GGGI. We have had the The CRFM Third Strategic Plan, Work Plan 2024-2025, we want to focus on the implementation of the MOU and specifically want to look at sourcing and mobilizing resources, working collaboratively on the regional data and the ghost scare incidents, and also communicating. I think this is one of the areas we thought was very important, was for us to communicate with member states and the territories about the collaboration that we have with GGGI in addressing ghost scares problem, but also to spread the word about the impacts of ghost scare on the fishery sector and our food security. So in terms of, we have sat down with GGGI and we have made a roadmap of how we want to move forward. And as a starting point, we felt, again, the awareness building was important. So since 2023, we have planned webinars, sessions, and we started on September 8th when we did sign the MOU, but also we started to have the discussion about the strategies for tackling abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gears. And we have had 2 sessions thus far. This is our second, looking at abandoned, lost, and we want to move forward. But today is very critical for us. We want to look specifically at the Caribbean Regional Action Plan and then to make some decisions about how it is that we move forward in the implementation of this plan. So we are welcoming your participation here today, and we are looking forward to your suggestions and how we can refine and improve on this document. And so thank you again for listening, and we're happy to be working with GGGI on abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gears in the Caribbean. I thank you. So again, that was my quick presentation, and I would really like us to move on to the third and final presentation for today, looking at the Caribbean Regional Action Plan. And I'm hoping for some spirited discussions on this and how we can move this forward and how we can ensure that we have addressed a number of the policy issues that Hannah spoke about earlier. So over to you, Joel, on the Caribbean Regional Action Plan, a deep dive. Thank you.
Very enlightening. I'm glad that we've been able to set the scene. Diving into the Caribbean Regional Action Plan that has been mentioned a couple of times, I'll do a quick review of what we talked about on our previous webinar with the CRFM, where we sort of touched on this very briefly. For those that weren't perhaps here for the previous one, I won't go into as much detail as I did last time for those introductory slides, but just to help set the scene. And then we'll go into a little bit of a deeper look at what the plan actually contains. We won't go through every particular layer of it. It's available in the webinar documents. So anyone who wants to take a look at it, please do. Yeah, we can do that. But I would love to just have a discussion about some of the high level things that we're talking about here. And when we're talking about there we go. When we're talking about a regional action plan, again, as Hannah mentioned before, this is based on the best practice framework for the management of fishing gear for wild capture fisheries, which is one of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative's key knowledge product documents. You saw Hannah link to those earlier today. They're freely available on the GGGI website at www.ghostgear.org in the resources section. So that was meant to be a globally applicable document looking at the risks associated with specific gear classes, and then looking at how certain stakeholders across the seafood supply chain or those touching the seafood supply chain might be able to provide some solutions to ALDFG related issues based on where they are. So this would be specific to fishers and fish harvesters, vessel operators, fisheries managers, technology companies, academic institutions, seafood certification schemes, on and on. So there was about a dozen different stakeholder groups that were identified, and we had very tailored, specific advice on how to prevent, mitigate, and remediate ALDFG that was focused on those specific groups. So very tangible actions that they could take. So what we did with the Caribbean Regional Action Plan is we took that framework, well, it's right there in the name, the best practice framework. We took that framework and tried to apply that to the Caribbean context to the best of our ability at the time, based on some of the work that we had done, some of the research that had been done that we were aware of, and sort of tailoring it to the Caribbean as a region, these regional challenges that we face. There is a general lack of data and research. We've done some work in the Caribbean, as Dr. Grant mentioned, dating back to 2018. We're continuing to work in the Caribbean now through these webinars and looking for other means to continue the research and the project work that we've already done. But even then, there is a lot more work to be done and a lot more data and research to be done in the region. We'll talk a little bit in more detail toward the end of this presentation about what some of those pieces have been. And also where we would need to go, but there is a general lack of data and research. And I should also point out, this isn't necessarily unique to the Caribbean region at all. There is a general lack of data and research, I would say, overall, when it comes to ALDFG in a global context. It's a relatively nascent thing when it comes to the marine debris issue, as Hannah mentioned multiple times in her presentation. It's definitely gaining global traction, but there is a general lack of data and research, and we need more of that, specifically in specific contexts, to tailor solutions appropriately, because no matter where we are in the world, we find that you absolutely need to do that. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So more data and more research is definitely needed. And again, variation in local capacity to address the issue. Hannah brought this up in her presentation as well, specifically when talking about the some of these global frameworks, whether you're talking about IMO and potential for global gear marking, which may or may not come to pass, or whether you're talking about the ILBI or the plastics treaty. And it's great to have, and we're obviously, as Hannah had mentioned, advocating for the inclusion of ALDFG into these global policy mechanisms, but we need to make sure that the way that it's written, it takes into account the variation in local capacity to address the issue. So not everywhere is going to have the same amount of resources in terms of, it could be financial resources, it could be human resources, it could be infrastructure, to be able to deal with this issue. So when you're coming up with these blanket approaches, you need to be careful about the understanding that not all member states, whether you're talking about in a global context or in a regional context like we are here, will have the same capacity in order to address the issue. So that's been a challenge. Variation in fisheries management measures. Obviously, every member state in the Caribbean will have its own fisheries management measures. We're talking about different species being fished a lot of the times with different gear types. We even see the same species being fished with different gear types in member states that are relatively close to one another, as close as you can, when you're talking about a sort of an archipelago type region. But the variation in fisheries management measures, and again, relates to the local capacity to address the issue as well, needs to be taken into context, which again is why some of the resolution of the recommendations here might be a little higher level, but having some of those on-the-ground experiences and feedback about why certain things may or may not work in a certain context is really what we need to try to tailor it. Lack of options for end-of-life gear. We had talked about this before. Hannah also mentioned this in her presentation, looking at options for end-of-life gear in a more global context, EPR being one potential way to fuel or at least fund potential options for end-of-life gear. In the Caribbean, obviously, depending on where you are, the general consensus seems to be that landfills are the sort of go-to disposal method, not unique to the Caribbean at all. But most Caribbean states tend to be islands. They have limited space. Those landfills are filling up. And we need to look at other options for end-of-life gear, whether that's recycling, even though we don't have necessarily the infrastructure in place within the Caribbean region to do large-scale manufacture, or large-scale recycling. And then even the inter-island transportation between islands, very expensive, not really practical at the end of the day. So looking at end-of-life solutions can be difficult as well. So that gear doesn't get discarded into the marine environment for a lack of alternatives. As we said, Fisher wants to do that, but in the absence of any alternatives, we see that as a key driver of ALDFG around the world. Variation in fishing practices and gear that's being used. Same thing with the fisheries management measures. So seeing that you might fish the same species using two very different gear types, which have very different implications for ALDFG loss, not only just with the gear themselves, but sometimes in the environments in which they're used. So if you're looking at spiny lobster in Jamaica, for example, fishers can go quite far out to lay traps for that gear. There's often out of contact. This is very different, out of contact with land, I should say, very different than the situation in, say, the archipelago in Belize, where you might find much more shallow environments, fishers setting rather individual traps one at a time. Very different environment, very different ALDFG risks associated with those two different fishing practices, even though they're targeting essentially the same species. And then a lack of education and overall awareness of the issue. Again, not unique to the Caribbean. We see this all over the world. There tends to be a general lack of awareness within the fishing community, I would say, about the long-term impacts of ALDFG. This is not surprising, simply because even the scientific community who's been researching this topic doesn't have firm impacts, or sorry, a firm idea of the impacts all the time. It seems to be quite narrowly focused, sort of smaller study areas when you're talking about very specific implications of a specific fishery or gear type or region in which gear is being used. So the general lack of awareness of what the long-term impacts of ALDFG might be in a local context is not unique to the Caribbean at all. Although GCFI in particular, and I think we have Fadila on the line here as well, who can maybe speak to this in the discussion point later. I don't want to put you on the spot, Fadila, but has created some excellent fisher outreach and education materials, working together with the GGGI, but I think those are also available as part of the webinar materials. But that being said, didn't deter us. We still wanted to make sure that we were going to create some sort of a regional action plan with the goal that this could then be adopted and again incorporated into existing marine litter action plans or other similar types of documentations, processes, procedures where they might exist within the member states in the Caribbean. So this was very much meant to be a collaborative effort between the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, Fisheries Management, fishers using the CRFM, and the GCFI to sort of help make those linkages and make sure that everyone's on the same page about what we're talking about, feeding into a final action plan. So the draft was created in 2020, 2021, based again on the GGGI best practice framework. There was engagement with fishers, fisheries management, CRFM, GCFI to try to get some initial feedback and stakeholder engagement, which we did and incorporated into the version that you'll see in the webinar materials. And then developing that into, well, when I say final action plan, I mean an actual product. That doesn't mean that it's final. The whole point of having these sessions here to chat about that is to make sure that we are as we're getting new information, new research is being done, new projects are being implemented, new learnings, we want to make sure that there's a way to incorporate that into this plan to make it as applicable as possible in the long term, and then of course leveraging our relationships with CRFM, GCFI, some of our Caribbean member states as well, to further that. And so the way the regional action plan is set up, there is a background and rationale why we need this, essentially going into a lot of what I just talked about now, and then an overview of Caribbean fisheries at the time, based on what was available at the time. We're talking sort of 2021-ish. Rationale for the Caribbean Action Plan. And then Section 2 goes into a gear class risk assessment, similar to the best practice framework that I spoke about earlier, where there are risks for gear classes, and we'll go into which classes those are, and then recommendations based across the stakeholder groups that we were targeting for the Regional Action Plan. In this case, it's fishers and vessel operators, as well as fishing organizations, fishers co-ops, fisherfolk co-ops, looking at what practical steps they can take to address this issue in the Caribbean. And again, the guiding principle here has to be that the actions and the best practices that are recommended within this document, very similar to the best practice framework, they need to be simple, they need to be pragmatic, they need to be affordable, they need to be realistic. Because, if you're talking about GPS tracking every buoy that's out there in the Caribbean, it's just not necessarily realistic. It's not that there's not a use for technology like that, but it needs to be adapted to the local context. So we wanted to make sure that we were doing that when we were looking at these recommendations. And so this is obviously a very high level snapshot. And the sort of things that we were talking about when we're talking about the overview of the Caribbean fisheries, looking at a way to really highlight that fisheries represent a way of life for tens of thousands of people in the Caribbean. We're talking about food security, we're talking about economic stability, and really putting that into context about one of the key reasons why we're looking to do this. There's obviously the environmental aspects of ALDFG as well, but we wanted to put the people back into it as well and make sure that that was one of the guiding principles of this, is to understand that we want to try to make life better for those who are reliant on fisheries within the Caribbean in a variety of ways. And noting that most species that were harvested are considered fished at sustainable levels, all those spiny lobster and queen conch, and this comes from the SOFIA report, the State of Fisheries and Aquaculture report from UNFAO back in 2021, I believe. So this may have changed since then. This is another instance of where we're talking about the action plan as it exists now, and there's probably more information that we should be gathering into that report, but just sort of giving an overall context of where fisheries are within the Caribbean. And of course, the region is at increased risk for climate-related stressors. So things like increased storm activity causing more gear loss, whether that's on the land or whether it's deployed. This has been something we've observed in multiple Caribbean member states. Ocean acidification and associated coral bleaching doesn't necessarily factor into lost and abandoned fishing gear, but lost and abandoned fishing gear can be another stressor on coral reefs. Of course, I think there's about 10% of the world's coral reefs exist in the Caribbean, so definitely a major consideration there as well. And then changing currents and patterns when it comes to either temperature or the direction or speed of those currents and the direction of those currents obviously just equates to a changing ecosystem, and we want to make sure that those additional stresses are taken into consideration when we're looking at this. And so when it comes to the effects of ALDFG in the region, this is again not dissimilar from other parts of the world, but talking about the mortality of harvestable aquatic species, so what species are actually being targeted, as well as vulnerable marine animals, could be marine mammals, birds, via entanglement and ingestion. That is what most people think of when they're thinking about the impacts of lost and abandoned fishing gear, and of course these are very acute impacts. But there's also, as I mentioned, implications for regional food security and livelihoods, economic security for the Caribbean as well. Wanted to make sure that that was built in. Habitat and benthic damage from nets and heavy structures. Again, we're talking specifically about any nets that might drape over coral reefs, either when they're, and this refers to not only when they get first lost or snagged on a coral reef, but also intends to be an issue in terms of removal as well, because coral has a tendency to grow around nets that have been there for quite some time. So when you're removing, you want to make sure you're not doing more damage to those coral structures just simply by removing the nets. So making sure that that was taken into consideration. Navigation hazards, fouling and entanglement of propellers and rudders. We heard some anecdotal reports throughout the Caribbean region that this was an issue here. Again, not dissimilar to the rest of the world. And contribution to aquatic microplastics. And I know this is of interest to several organizations who are working in the Caribbean looking at quantifying this in terms of lost plastic items, nets, ropes. They will abrade over time, contributing to micro and nanoplastics. And there's been a large volume of research material that's come out over the past few years about that in particular. And then also, I think another big one for the Caribbean is the social impact of fishing debris on recreation and tourism. There is obviously a very substantial tourist industry within the Caribbean, and we won't go into thoughts about whether that is a good or a bad thing. I know that there are both sides of that equation represented a lot of the time, but simply having that, there is an impact on tourism, not only, again, restricted to the Caribbean. We've seen this in places like Myanmar and the Miak Archipelago, one of the most supposedly untouched places in the world, and still the photo that you're seeing to the right on this slide is actually from the Miak Archipelago to illustrate that point, just that this does affect ecotourism and recreational tourism as well. And so the key stakeholders that we focused on when we were looking at who do we want to really target the advice and the recommendations and the best practices to within this document were fishers and vessel operators. So so those who are actually out on the water harvesting seafood for their means of making a living. Fisheries managers and regulators. So again, working with the CRFM primarily to reach out to fisheries managers and regulators about how they might be able to lend some of their expertise and thoughts to this whole process as well. And fisheries organizations, we're thinking fisherfolk organizations for the most part in the Caribbean, about how they can sort of expand the impact of ALDFG prevention, mitigation, and remediation strategies in the region. So when it comes to the very practical, tailored approach, those are the organizations, or sorry, the stakeholder groups that we had targeted. And then the gear classes, I mentioned that we would talk about those as well. So the document itself is split up by gear classes. And these are split up into the highest risk to lowest risk in terms of what the Global Ghost Gear Initiative's best practice framework has broadly broken them down into in terms of risk of loss and then impacts once lost. So we go across gill nets, fads or fish aggregating devices, traps and pots, long lines, bottom trawls, hooks and lines, midwater trawls, and seine nets in that order, and try to tailor the approaches to those specific gear types across those stakeholder categories to the extent that we could. Some of them will be overlapping, but of course, some of the prevention measures for making sure a gill net doesn't get lost are going to be very different than a long line, a bottom trawl, a midwater trawl, or whatever it might be. And so I'll just go over some of the broad strokes, some examples of some of the broad strokes recommendations that are contained within these. And again, there is overlap, but we'll go over prevention first, and then mitigation, and then remediation, just to give a flavor for some of the things that are there. Again, recognizing that this might not always be practical or possible in every particular context, but we're trying to look at a regional approach. So some thoughts on some of these things would be very useful. So in no particular order, so carrying gear recovery equipment on board where it's practical to do so, making sure that if you do lose your gear, that you do have a method to actually recover it. Now, most fishers will practice this anyway because they don't want to lose that gear. So again, some of this will be pretty, a lot of these recommendations came from fishers themselves. But for those that don't, making sure that you do have some sort of equipment to recover whatever the gear type is, where practical to do so, just to make sure that you're able to try to recover it when you can. And we do realize that that's not always possible. Weather, particularly, can be very volatile in the Caribbean, as we're all aware, may prevent that type of thing, especially if you're fishing in rough weather already. But having that gear present is better than not having it present. Developing safe gear recovery and training protocols. As I say to anyone who will listen, when you're a fisher out on the water and you're trying to recover gear that's been lost, weather and all of these different things can make it not a very safe activity, depending on what type of vessel you're on, what type of gear you're trying to recover, and whatever the local conditions are. So developing safe gear recovery training and protocols is probably a wise thing to do. And this can be done either officially or maybe even unofficially through fisherfolk cooperatives and things like that, or to at least start there to try to understand what practices are already in place and how we can spread those through different member states and different fishers using different equipment throughout the Caribbean. Developing gear conflict avoidance plans and procedures, other similar codes of practice. So this is things like making sure that there is a geospatial overlay is minimized between different fisheries happening with different gear types at the same time. So you want to make sure that you don't have trawling happening in the same place as traps and pots if they're happening concurrently, for example, and other similar types of codes of practice. But I think another key element of this is making sure that there's just a lot of communication going on between shipping industries and the fishing industry and cruise ships. I know are a big part of many Caribbean member states as well. So just making sure there's communication there, and so trying to avoid that gear conflict where possible. And again, this might look very different depending on where you are, but in broad strokes, looking at that would be advisable, especially because some of the research that we had done and some of the outcomes highlighted gear conflict, either with other fishers or with other marine traffic, as being a major source, rather, of gear loss in the region. Restricting or limiting the areas in which multiple gear types are used concurrently, sort of very similar to the above, making sure that you minimize the likelihood of different gears interacting with one another and causing unintentional loss. Avoiding deploying gear in inclement weather, very easy thing to say, but I myself have worked with fishers for 20 years of my life. I know that this is not always easy, but where possible, making sure that you're not deploying in a situation that could lead to gear loss if and when it's possible. And I know that, speaking to the Jamaican example earlier, if fishers are going quite far offshore, monitoring weather reports is not always feasible if you're outside of cell phone range and dropping traps. So, and I know the weather can change very quickly. So, or at least having a plan of what to do in the event of that weather when it comes to gear retrieval and or just making it back safely. Considering subsidies for fishers to facilitate investment in new technologies related to gear loss prevention. This would be things like gear lending libraries, where you might, it might not be practical for every fisher to test out gear, new gear technology, especially if it's prohibitively expensive. But if there's a way to have sort of central hubs, there's models for that in Canada, the United States, the UK, to look at having some of that technology available for fishers to use in certain situations that may be possible. Again, it would require investment, and that may or may not be practical for certain contexts. But even if it's outside funding, if there is a desire for fishers to continue using some of the technology that we've either tested in the Caribbean or other types of tech that have yet to be tested in the Caribbean, that's one particular model that has worked well in other areas. Limiting soak times where you can, again, not always possible. Same thing with the inclement weather. But if there's a, don't leave your gear out for a week at a time or something like that, not that I'm necessarily suggesting that's what happens, but coming up with some practical guidance or legislation about what those soak times should be. Practicing regular maintenance and replacing worn gear before it gets lost. Again, a lot of fishers will do this already, but it's a good way to make sure that gear doesn't get lost as a result of simply not realizing that that rope was frayed or that that shackle was worn or whatever it might be. Identifying common needs across regional member states and looking at a regional approach, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to create this document as well. Looking at marine spatial planning, again, how would this this type of regional action plan specific to ALDFG be potentially incorporated into existing regional action plans or marine litter plans that might already exist, and then making sure that there's communication across those bodies and between those member states to make sure that we are addressing it as holistically as we can and make sure that everyone's talking to one another. And then encouraging, again, regular communication with ocean users to avoid setting gear in high traffic areas where it's possible. Just those simple communication pieces can go a long way. Doesn't mean that everyone's necessarily going to play nicely with one another. We know everyone's using, all sort of ocean users have their own agendas, but nobody wants to get tangled in fishing gear, whether it's a marine, whether it's another fishing vessel or whether it's another marine user. So just having those conversations can actually lead to a lot of that prevention of gear getting lost in the first place. Moving on very quickly to mitigation, no-fault gear loss reporting requirements and data tracking. Hannah mentioned this in her presentation as well, but it's very important, A, to collect data on gear loss rates. Dr. Grant had mentioned some anecdotal gear loss rates in her presentation, and I think that Peter had put some gear loss rates for a particular, very specific fisheries as well in the chat. But trying to get a better understanding of what those gear loss rates actually look like is critical. And as Hannah mentioned, it's important to make sure that this is no fault. No fishers really wanting to lose their gear, but you can't really start to understand what's actually going on and develop policy management practices, for example, without actually having access to that raw data. Hannah had mentioned the Canadian system that's put in place as a condition of licensing as one way. That's sort of on the extreme end in terms of the technology required in order to do that, but there are other ways that we can look at developing something like that. Establishing gear restrictions to minimize potential for gear loss. This would give things like depths for gill nets and things like that. If you have restrictions on those when they're fished in certain environments, that might minimize those gill nets, for example, getting hooked up on coral reefs or other underwater obstructions. We've seen them make those types of regulatory approaches make a very marked difference between, say, Canada and the United States here on the West Coast where I am, where there are gear depth restrictions in Canada. There are not necessarily in Washington State, just south of the border. And that plays out into more gear loss, even when fishing in a very similar environment. So some of those things, very practical. Where possible, construct gear out of non-plastic materials. We've seen this in Belize with the traps that are used there, with the Antillean Z traps in Jamaica. So some of this is already being done, but where possible, if you can use those local materials to minimize environmental impacts if it's lost, always helpful to do that. And implementing potential requirements for escape hatches for traps and pots, for example, to minimize their potential to ghost fish if they are lost, or at least disable the trap so that it doesn't become the cyclic ghost fishing doesn't continue. And remediation, implementing gear marking in line with FAO voluntary guidelines, trying to understand where gear is coming from, because it's not always necessarily from the member state in which it's lost. Sometimes that can drift, and trying to understand how gear marking can help with that as well. Developing appropriate gear management regulations. So again, depth limits on gill nets, limits on the amount of fads that can be deployed, etc. Implementing licensing and enforcement consistency. This might be more challenging, but learning from what works in one region and then trying to adapt that to a local context from one member state to another, we've also seen high degrees of success elsewhere. And then consider developing fisher-led gear retrievals in areas of high concentration in the off-season. I mean, it's in everybody's best interest to get gear out of the water. Fishers are the ones who know where it is more than anybody else. And I think they're best suited to do that. Again, sometimes this requires external funding because there's fuel and time that needs to be taken into consideration, but we've seen fisher-led gear retrievals in areas of high concentration in Western Canada, for example, the Area A crab fishery in BC, and it works very well, and it's something that they decided to do long ago and have been doing for decades. I'm not going to go through this in detail because we're going to try to wrap this up and leave time for discussion, but just to give an idea of some of the reference documents that were used to sort of craft some of the recommendations that were in the regional action plan. Some of these are quite recent, some of them are a little bit older. This is what was available to us at the time. If we are missing a whole bunch of things here, please let us know, because we would love to go through additional literature and see what we can pull out of there. And Peter, I do see your hand there. I have a couple more slides. I will come back to that in just one second. But there's a lot of documents I'm sure that we are missing here. These are the primary ones that we were basing most of it on, in addition to obviously our own experiences in the Caribbean. And since then, since 2021, we have done some gear loss modeling as well with GGGI member natural resources consultants, and we have created predictive models for Belize, the British Virgin Islands, Jamaica, Grenada, Montserrat, Trinidad, and Tobago, which also used the FAO gear loss surveys, which FAO has developed and is implementing in fisheries around the world to essentially direct conversations with fishers to determine what are the key gear loss causes around the world, what are the rates of loss, primary drivers, etc. So we've been working with the FAO to implement those surveys in all of these countries, and then looking at their responses, which are proportionally representative of those fisheries, and then looking at working with NRC to look at those responses, and then mapping areas of known gear loss concentrations and other relevant data sets, so things like wind, currents, other marine traffic, fishing effort, those types of things, putting them together into these predictive models and trying to better ascertain what's going on. The results of those predictive models, they have not been implemented into the regional action plan to date, because we're talking about it as it exists as the 2021 version, but it would obviously be a logical next step to take some of the information there and apply it to the action plan, which we have not yet done, but we would like to do. And again, additional information is needed. We need more fisher surveys in those Caribbean countries. We would very much like to do that. And again, looking at more predictive models based on those survey results to try to really refine those different data sets and try to come up with where are the areas for gear loss, what are the primary key drivers and reasons for them at a national and a regional level, and trying to see where to direct those efforts in terms of prevention and remediation. Verification surveys to confirm the presence and absence of gear at some of these sites. And I should say as well that confirming the absence of gear accumulation is every bit as valuable as confirming the presence of it. So that's something that's often overlooked. More input from stakeholders in the region, such as everyone who's on the line today, getting some of that feedback into that and seeing how we can incorporate that. And then, of course, development of gear disposal options in line with the local context, which we touched on earlier. This is sort of a broad where we'd like to go with it, and based on what we need in order to refine it. So again, education and awareness, capacity building, data reporting, super important to try to get a handle on this and understand what the best practices might actually be in a local regional context. And as technology, innovation, and new projects come into play, the ways that we manage ALDFG will change. So we don't see this as something that would necessarily just be a one and done, but something that we could probably continuously research and add to over time. So that's a whole lot of talking from me. I do apologize. Let's move on to the feedback and discussion part of the webinar. So Sandra, I will turn it over to you. And of course, noting that Peter had raised his hand for a question not too long ago.
Thank you so much, Joel. Reading the action plan again and again, one of the things that came out, you spoke about prevention, mitigation, and remediation. And for me, it was mark, track, report, retrieve, and repurpose. So those are the things that just came out of the plan for me in a very simple way. And then we had a lot of intervention in the chat, and we also had Peter Ann. So the thing is, gears will be lost. So go ahead, Peter. Tell.
Well, thank you. No, I just wanted to thank all three presenters for giving us a very good perspective. I wanted to get a word in edgewise before I run off to the airport. One of the things we have to be careful about, especially when we come to mitigation, is the issue of the alternatives. For example, it was mentioned that changing to wooden traps, creating traps out of wood. In some of the jurisdictions, which are limited in terms of the accessible forest cover, when they go to use wood, for example, in one particular country which will remain unnamed, what they do is they use mangrove. That is the more easily accessible types of wood available for traps. Of course, you recognize the challenge that is from the ecological standpoint. It means denuding the mangrove forests and so forth. So the caution in terms of mitigation is that we have to be very careful not to potentially create another ecological problem in attempting to mitigate the challenges currently existing in dealing with ALDFG. Just I thought I would mention that because that specific one came to my mind. Thank you.
Absolutely, Peter. And I think that is a very important underscore of how this needs to be adapted to a local context as well. And it was less necessarily, I should clarify, about it's more emphasizing that is actually already being done in Belize and in Jamaica, and those materials are already being used. But again, understanding that local context is critically important. And we've done that. We've heard similar things talking about, say, fisheye grading devices and making them out of biodegradable materials in parts of the South Pacific, for example, and where I've heard instances of that where the material that you're harvesting to make those is actually causing more damage because you're removing that material from small islands and then using it to make feds and altering the local biology there. So yeah, the point is well taken, and just another underscore of why we need to have these conversations and hear directly from folks like you that have this expertise. So thanks, Peter, as always.
Okay, so next I will ask Amparo to voice his questions, but I'm also putting on call Narissa to talk about the Rubik 3 project, and I also wanted to ask Nilo by Phil and Fab in the French sector for the recycling and use. to give us an update on some of those activities in terms of recycling. So first, Amparo from FAO. Amparo, sorry.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for giving me the floor. I just had a very general question about the regional action plan. So I understand from in particular from the conclusion that the regional action plan is kind of a guidance document providing recommendations on how to address the issue of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear in the region. But I wonder if you guys, CRFM and GGGI, are somehow monitoring the implementation of the action plan, or focusing on some specific actions, maybe as per your memorandum of understanding, because well, from what I remember, very important point from my personal point of view was the question of the data collection on ALDFG, which is very much needed to have a standardized way to collect that type of data, and also with regards to the ongoing international discussions on the global treaty on plastic pollution, but also on this ongoing discussions under IMO, International Maritime Organization, for mandatory gear loss reporting requirements. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amparo. Good to see you. Yeah, so I would say, and Sandra, please feel free to jump in from your perspective as well. I think when we implemented the first version of the action plan, or at least completed the first version, I should say, we were sort of right in the height of the pandemic. We were looking for ways to engage with the CRFM and in the Caribbean more broadly, but it was more difficult to do at that time, as we all know. And now I think we're at a stage where this is essentially what we're trying to do. Is the next step, is to gather more feedback and see how do we operationalize this, and what is the right method to do that. So we're not tracking at the minute how or if the document is being used, but I would love to find a pathway to do that. And again, I think this series of webinars is sort of a kickoff point, sort of re-engaging on that now that everyone's sort of got their feet back under them to the extent that we all can, and trying to find that sort of concrete pathway forward. So I hope that makes sense, but I think that's kind of, well, my vision for it anyway, feeding on from this, is hopefully we get quite a bit of constructive feedback, and that we can work with the CRFM and other regional stakeholders to find how we can operationalize that document.
Agreed, Joel. I think that's exactly why we're here today. And we're hoping after this, you and I and other partners, we will meet together to do exactly just that, and to add the monitoring aspects of the plan, implementation and monitoring aspects of the plan. The other thing is looking where the resources are and tapping into those resources and building on that. So at this juncture, we talk about the general lack of data, and so we'll hear from Nerissa and her project as to what they have been doing in order to remedy that. Thanks. Go ahead, Nerissa.
Thanks, Sandra. Hi, all. I apologize for joining late. I was at another meeting. My name is Nerissa Lucky. I am the technical project coordinator for the Rubik Tree project. And that project looks at managing bycatch, addressing discard, and addressing abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear in 4 Caribbean countries: Barbados, Trinidad, Ghana, and Suriname. And part of our work program actually involves the collection of the ALDFG surveys. So we would have engaged the FAO Rome, and Amparo is aware. Tomorrow we have a training for the teams in Ghana, Barbados, and Suriname. Trinidad and Tobago has already completed their survey of their gillnets, their ALDFG survey, but we plan to execute those ALDFG surveys in those 3 countries. We have already identified the country teams and the executing partners at the fisheries departments in those countries. And those teams will be going out, will be receiving training tomorrow from the FAO on the questionnaire, they've already completed their pre-survey questionnaire and identified their sample sizes for the various target fisheries that they have under the Rubik project. And we will be executing those ALDFG surveys in the very near future, and having the FAO analyze the data, and the country reports will be prepared for those ALDFG surveys. Trinidad, having already done their ALDFG surveys, will undergo a risk assessment, and will also look at marking of gears. So our lead consultant, is currently working on a guidance document on the marking of gears for Trinidad and for the other countries, so that they can see what works best for them. And they've been having these discussions, so hopefully we will be able to move and advance the process of marking the gears. And we also work under the EAF OSG project, which looks at data collection. The Calypso system is a platform that is applied in Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, and we are looking at standardized data collection and recording under the Calypso system for gear. So those gear markings will be incorporated into Calypso system through their domestic registry systems, their licensing and registration systems, and hopefully we'll be able to improve on the data collection and analysis and mitigation measures to come coming out of these initial steps.
Excellent. So Nerissa, would you be able to share that with GGI, Triple GI, and the CRFM, the results of the outcomes of those training surveys and marking, to see some of the lessons learned from your project?
Yes, sure. I mean, we do want to partner with all in the region, and of course, if it helps with the implementation of the action plans, I see synergies there already. So yes, the countries, of course, are the executing partners and our member countries of CRFM. So we look forward to working with everybody.
Thank you, Nerissa. I see Peter, your hand is up.
Thank you very much. I had wanted to speak to the issue of gear marking. Some time ago, the IUU working group of WCAF had proposed a recommendation to the Commission in terms of standardizing or gear marking. That did not go down too well at the time. I am not too sure more recently what the view is, but in the region there seems to be a reticence about pushing for game marking for a number of reasons that probably will take another webinar in itself to discuss. But I think it's something we want to bear in mind. Again, when we are talking about some of these initiatives, very often you'll find that one subgroup is willing to go in a direction, and there's a, let's say, caution on the part of the other subsets of that group, and it makes for a very interesting political cultural situation, which has got to be borne in mind. I say that not to be negative, but to try and remind ourselves that we have to deal with a lot of competing perspectives. Joel has noted the fact that, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but we have to try and work out the extent to which we can get as many sites to fit as many people, as many oils as possible. And the issue of, for example, spatial planning and its utilization in that context, not just in terms of the marking of gear, but for example, the use of marine space is something that has to be borne in mind. But I try to drop it in quickly because I have to leave shortly. I just wanted to bring that into the discussion, that the reality of the different perspectives and imperatives of different member countries within this broad grouping is something that we got to find a way to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So we talked about the disposal of the ghost gears, and we talk about the end of life of the gear, and there's also the recycling aspect of the gear. So we want to ask Amelie, if you can open your mic and tell us you have it in the chat. We were directed to the website on the recycling work that is being done by Nilo by Phil and Fab in the French sector for the recycling and used gear. And that is an opportunity that we can consider in the, how can we expand on that? Utilizing, repurposing these gears to do other things, especially since we have a landfill problem and fishers are not able to dump their gear at the appropriate spaces. Any other questions? Any other concerns?
Chair, since nobody else is talking, while you give them a chance to think, I just wanted to point to the fact that the question of repurposing of gear is a very useful one. The challenge is that in most instances, the state of the gear, when it is available for repurposing, limits how it can be used. In some jurisdictions, they've attempted to use it in craft, the arts market in terms of craft for tourists and so forth. But there's only so much of it that you can use in craft and so forth. So just like I say, I'm taking up space. We have to also look at that yes, there are alternative uses, yes, there are repurposing, but in small populations, in small areas, small island developing states, there are challenges in the extent to which it can be repurposed. I'm not saying that we should not consider it, but I'm saying again, we have to look at it's got to be like a blitzkrieg. We're going to take many different approaches in many different situations for many different countries to achieve the same ends. There's no few options that work. It's a multiplicity. Just what I wanted to, while people are thinking of other things to say, I'll drop those thoughts in. Thank you.
Thank you, people. At the same time, we have Kelsey from FAO and Dwight Neal making comments in the chat. Would you like to say it verbally?
Sure.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Sure. Thank you, Sandra. I'm really enjoying your facilitation in terms of ensuring that everyone who's commenting in the chat is held accountable to share in person. Firstly, thank you to CRFM and GGGI for this excellent webinar. I've really enjoyed being a quiet fly on the wall until now. It's just been excellent discussions and really important work that you're all doing, including to update the regional action plan. It's just a minor comment that if anyone is interested in the specific topic of fishing gear recycling, FAO in coordination with our colleagues at IMO recently published a report supported by the Glow Litter Partnerships Project last year that's called Fishing Gear Recycling Technologies and Practices. It's quite broad because it was designed for global audiences, but it addresses sort of variety of considerations around available technologies and practices. So definitely interesting to see the link that was provided in the chat earlier for that too. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So Dwight is asking, what percentage of the fishers remove the damage or end-of-life gear from the marine space?
Thanks, Sandra.
Oh, thank you, Dwight.
I think I should put my camera on as well. Here we go. Is that better?
Much better.
Nice
seeing you, Dwight.
Same here. We are in the same country and we never get to see each other. But anyway, that's a different story. No, I was just questioning it because there's a big push with a project that I'm doing right now to look at solid waste management in the marine space and how to encourage fishers to not only with gear, but also with other forms of solid waste to get them to bring it back to the dock. And my thing is that it's very difficult to get fishers to do that. So I was wondering to what extent do we have any idea of fishers and what percentage of fishers actually do bring their gear back unless they're absolutely expected to do so. I know in Belize, the trap fishers usually pull a percentage of their gear out of the water at the close season, which was at the end of February, but it's primarily for repair purposes. Normally what happens is that gear gets left in the water if it's no longer functional. So I was just trying to get an idea of how many fishers do we reasonably think would go out and retrieve the gear or bring it back to the dock, so that you could get an idea of what size of the population you need to target in whatever interventions you're doing.
Okay, so we need to get the gear out of the water and we need to put it somewhere in a properly stored. Any comments? I see Peter Randall making an intervention. And I see Alina Joseph.
I would just say that if we had to think of the whole approach within the plastic bottles and persons returning and recycling comes at a cost. So I would imagine if we had to consider a similar approach for fishers in retrieving lost gear and the recycling approach, it may be something that we need to sensitize them on to encourage the retrieval and possibly looking at not a rebate, but more or less a payment for the return. That might possibly be something to consider. It will come at a cost, of course, but to really get them engaged and willing to undertake that retrieval. We must appreciate also that it's also a challenge to retrieve those lost gear, as Joel and Hannah would have pointed out. And it's something that we need to bear in mind if we have to now condition and encourage that culture of the retrieval and recycling of gear. Also too, in terms of looking at the amount of gear that's retrieved and seeing the opportunities for recycling in the craft and looking at different approaches to recycle the gear, we may want to consider linkages with other plastic waste recycling subsectors. So you find there are persons who would bring in their plastic bottles, the plastic caps and what have you. The retrieval from lost fishing gear can augment some of those recycling plastic products. So we should not look at this approach in isolation, of course, and we need to consider other waste plastic waste recycling subsectors as a whole if we have to make any significant impact. And it also looks at not only looking at the practice or the implementation, but looking at the regulatory, the incentivizing those activities. So looking at a broader approach to plastic and lost fishing gear should be what we should be looking at when we review this action plan and looking at different actors in the recycling sector.
Thank you so much, Alina. Danny, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Danny James, fisherwoman from St. Lucia.
Welcome.
I was tasked with sensitizing and bringing the awareness to the fishers of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gears. And one of the things you find, the young fishers, they were very welcoming of the information and they're willing to work to do better. But the older fishers are caught up in their own primitive ways, and then they would not want to really change their primitive practices. The young fishers are very open to more education, more awareness. And one of the things they suggested is if they bring the education to them, then they're willing to support, they're willing to work with the organizations because they realize with climate change, the fish coming to landing now in St. Lucia is less than what we had years ago. But also in the northern part of St. Lucia, one of the fishing communities, Grozile, you find they bring the lost gear back to landing. But because of the distance of the dump site to the area, they leave all the gear on the landing site. And it's creating a problem, especially on that landing site, where when I visited it and I had the awareness campaign with the fishers, one of the issues they were saying is to get it down to the dump site is very costly because they have to pay a truck but the heat that's on there is so much as to when to get it onto the truck is also an issue, because they allow it to pile up very big. So the dump site is not very close to them, and to remove it from the landing site in Grosley to the dump site in the government dump site is very costly, and that's one of the issues. But one of the things I would suggest is to continue the education, especially with the young fishers, continue the sensitizing the awareness. And in St. Lucia, I'm a fisherwoman. That's my livelihood, and in whatever way I can help to bring the awareness to the fishers, especially the young fishers, I'm always willing to participate and be available to assist my younger fishers. Thank you.
Danny, thank you so much. But I want one quick question for you. What works in terms of building awareness? Is it one-on-one? Is it group meetings? How do you connect to young versus connect to the older fishermen? What works for you?
With me, I was once the president of St. Lucia Fisherfolk and president of my own cooperative, Goodwill Fishermen's Cooperative. So I would do group, I would go days, or I would send information to the cooperative, let them know I'll be coming, but I also had the numbers for the president of the different cooperatives. So I would engage them and let them know, or I would go a day or 2 days before, engage the fishers, let them know a day that's good for them, suitable for them. And I would go in group meetings with them. When I did my awareness campaign for the organization, I did group meetings with them, because I came up to the site a day before. I sensitized them and let them know I would be coming back a day after. Then they would tell me what time they would come from fishing, and then I would usually have a group meeting with them. So in discussing that with them, then the younger fishers very open and welcoming to the discussions and the awareness.
Thank you so much for your efforts on the ground, Danny. And the problems again seems to be getting the gears to the land, to the dumps.
Yes.
And that is that's an additional cost that it's something that we need to seriously consider. Thanks again for that. Any other thoughts?
Sandra, do you mind if I just jump in there very quickly?
Sure, Joel. And I'm watching the time as well.
Yep. Okay, great. I don't, people do need to tell me that before I start speaking. I apologize. But very quickly, I think, Danny, thank you for that. That it is very clear, a very clear parallel, no matter where we are, that seems to be the case. Definitely up here where I'm from in Western Canada, it is the older generations who tend to be more set in their ways. They've been doing it for 50, 60 years sometimes. So having them change their practices is just more difficult, and that's not necessarily a knock against them. That's just an observation of reality. Whereas those who are growing up in the younger generations are a little bit more malleable to these types of things. But I think your perspective is incredibly valuable, because that's how we're really going to reach the end users of the gear and start to understand what are the key drivers, what is their perspective. And I think very often fishers are the absent voice in the room. This gets discussed a lot of the time, but it's the actual harvesters themselves that are not as involved in the process. And we at the GGGI are trying to reverse that trend and include as many fishers as possible, not necessarily to amplify our own message, but to promote theirs and understand their perspectives. Because at the end of the day, there have been places or times where fishers are actually penalized in some countries for bringing gear back. They need to pay for that now. They're now charged for putting that gear in a disposal facility that's port side. Well, that is the easiest way to guarantee that no fisher's ever going to bring anything back ever again. So yeah, I mean, this is all a really good discussion. And when it comes to the recycling element of things, we actually did a webinar focused on circularity end of life options for fishing gear specific to the Caribbean a few years ago. I can see if I can dig up the recording of that if folks are interested, where we go into a lot more detail about logistics and transportation and costs to the fishers and where those barriers actually are. So there is a bit of work that's been done on that. If folks are interested, I can see if I can dig up the webinar link, because there was some good discussion around that. But I'll leave it there in the interest of time, Sandra. But yeah, I just wanted to throw those things out there.
Thank you, Joel. I wanted to read this one from Peter Randall from CFAS, and he says that if it has value, the fishers will bring in the lost gears. But he also notes that education and awareness may have a value rather than be considered litter, could lead to positive change in behaviors of fishers. But like you said, Joel, there are other issues as well that needs to be addressed from the national standpoint that will promote and support any gear retrieval process. Ladies and gentlemen, we could go on and talk about this for a lifetime. So I want you to, I see Adele put in the chat a form. If you have any further comments, suggestions, please add it to the form. We welcome your comments as we try to finalize this document, but most importantly, to operationalize and move it forward. So we would like to take the opportunity to thank you online participants for joining us today. We want to thank our presenters, myself, Joel, and Hannah for their presentation, especially to Hannah for waking up so early this morning to be part of the team this morning. So the CRFM looks forward to greater participation with GGGI and other partners in the fight against ALDFG in the region. We welcome your contribution to advancing this regional action plan. We will review your recommendations to finalize this document. And as I stated earlier in my presentation, the CRFM will collaborate with GGGI to implement the action plan as best as possible as we seek to source financial support to collectively address one of the most harmful forms of marine debris. I see a number of people have added information to the chat, so you can search to find additional information on different aspects of abandoned gear. So my last words to you are: mark it, track it, report, retrieve it, most importantly, if possible, repurpose. And all of this, a cross-cutting theme, education and awareness. Thanks again for your participation. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.